You are kneeling in the mute outside your own front door. Your neighbor is pointing at you. She is telling the village constable that your milk cow went dry the same week. Her infant son fell ill. That is the entire case against you. A dry cow and a sick baby. 3 houses apart. For you, this isn't paranoia. This is Tuesday in 1640s Europe. Somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people were tried for witchcraft across Europe. Between the 1400s and the 1700s, roughly half of them were executed. Most of them looked exactly like you. Poor, rural, usually a woman, though not always. Someone with no lawyer, no money, and no way to prove a negative. So let's reconstruct what actually happens to you next, using the real machinery that historians have pulled out of surviving court records. It starts small, a rumor. Maybe you argued with a neighbor over a fence line last spring. Maybe you're an old widow who lives alone and talks to her cat too loudly. In the world you live in, misfortune needs an author. Crops fail, cattle sicken, children die in their cribs at alarming rates, and someone has to be responsible. It cannot simply be bad luck. Bad luck is unbearable. A witch, at least, is a problem you can burn. The theological groundwork for this had already been laid over a century earlier. In 1487, Catholic clergyman named Heinrich Kramer published the Malleus Maleficarum, a manual arguing that witchcraft was real, widespread, and disproportionately practiced by women. It circulated for generations. By the time King James VI of Scotland wrote his own treatise, Demonology, in 1597, the idea wasn't fringe theology anymore. It was closer to accepted science. James had personally overseen the North Berwick witch trials a few years earlier, convinced that witches had conjured a storm to sink his ship. If a king believed it, why wouldn't your local magistrate? Now, you're formally accused. What happens to your body next? First comes the search for a witch's mark. Somewhere on your skin, examiners believe the devil has left a mark where he suckles from you. A mole, a birthmark, a patch of skin that doesn't bleed when pricked. You are stripped in front of strangers and examined inch by inch. In parts of Scotland and England, professional prickers made a living doing this, charging by the body. One of the most notorious, a man named John Kincaid, used retractable needles that sank into the skin without drawing blood, manufacturing proof where none existed. The fraud wasn't hidden, it was profitable. If the mark alone doesn't settle it, there's the water test. You're bound, thumbs to opposite toes, and lowered into a pond or river. Sink, and you're innocent. Though you may drown proving it, float, and the water has rejected you. And that's your confession. Notice the trap. There is no outcome in which you survive, as both alive and cleared. Sleep deprivation does the rest. In East Anglia in the 1640s, Matthew Hopkins, who called himself the Witchfinder General, built a private business around extracting confessions. This way, suspects were kept awake for days, walked back and forth by examiners in shifts, until exhaustion produced hallucinations, and hallucinations produced confessions. Hopkins and his associates are documented as responsible for the deaths of 100 to 200 people in just 2 years, most of them poor women in small villages who had never left their counties. He charged local towns a fee. Accusing you was, for some, a paying job. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Confession didn't require guilt. It required exhaustion. Historians studying the Pendle witch trials of 1612 found something similar. The trial pamphlet, compiled by clerk Thomas Potts, shows defendants offering detailed confessions, naming familiars, describing pacts, admitting to killings that never happened. Modern historians believe these confessions were shaped by leading questions from examiners who already knew what answer they wanted. You weren't confessing to what you did. You were confessing to what you were told you must have done. Not everyone believed the machinery was honest, even at the time. In 1584, an English gentleman named Reginald Scott published The Discovery of Witchcraft, arguing that accused witches were simply poor, isolated old women being scapegoated, and that the evidence was superstition, dressed up as procedure. His book was so controversial that King James reportedly ordered copies burned. Skepticism existed, it just rarely won. So picture your actual trial. There's no defense attorney in the way you'd recognize. The court assumes the Malleus Maleficarum is true. Spectral evidence testimony that your ghostly form appeared to someone in a dream and harmed them is admissible in many places, meaning you can be convicted for a crime a witness merely dreamed about, and you cannot cross-examine a dream. If convicted, the method of execution depends on where you live. In continental Europe, burning at the stake was standard. In England, witchcraft was legally classified as a felony, so hanging was more typical. Either way, your property was often seized. To cover the costs of your own trial, your family paid for your accusation, and then paid again for your death. Now, here's the twist that historians keep returning to. Because it complicates the tidy story, the panic wasn't constant. It came in waves, tied closely to real-world stress. Famine years, disease outbreaks, wars, and periods of intense religious upheaval. Some of the worst outbreaks, like in Arsberg and Bamberg in the 1620s, happened during years of crop failure and plague, when a village couldn't explain why everything was falling apart at once. A witch trial gave them a story with a villain and an ending. It was, in its own horrifying way, a coping mechanism disguised as justice, and the panics ended for equally practical reasons. Courts noticed that torture-derived confessions were internally inconsistent. Legal reformers, influenced by Enlightenment skepticism, began requiring higher standards of evidence. By the early 1700s, most European states had either restricted or abolished prosecutions. The last legal execution in England took place in 1716, in Scotland in 1727. The machinery didn't stop because people became kind. It stopped because the legal standards finally caught up. Here's your modern mirror. You don't live in a village that burns witches anymore, but you still live in a world that looks for a guilty person. The moment something goes wrong, that trusts confessions extracted under pressure, and lets a confident accuser outweigh a quiet defendant. Wrongful convictions today are still tied to coerced confessions, obtained after hours of interrogation. The pricking needle is gone. The impulse behind it, the need for anyone, to blame when things fall apart, is not. You were kneeling in the mud outside your own front door, waiting to find out whether a dry cow and a sick baby would be enough to end your life. It usually was.